Hi, my name is Marianne Krasny. I'm a professor at Cornell University, and I'm the author of the Food, Farms, and Climate Substack. Today, I have with me Cornell Senior, who's majoring in Environment and Sustainability, Janet Reddy. Actually, she's just about to be a Cornell graduate in a matter of a week or so. So Janet is a proud Fijian. She grew up in the Pacific Island nation of Fiji. And I met Janet when she was a student in my Climate Solutions course last fall. And I remember that you took off in the middle of the semester to go to Scotland as a UN Association Scotland Earth Ambassador representing Pacific Islands, which was pretty impressive. So, and this is just one of many of your impressive accomplishments at Cornell. So Janet, I wonder if we could start out with you just telling me a little bit about your childhood, what it was like growing up in Fiji, maybe what your family and parents did for a living, and how you got interested in the environment.
Of course. Well, firstly, I want to say Nisambula Vinaka, and that's how you say hello in Fijian, where I'm from. Fiji is a country. When I first moved to America for school, I realized that there was a lot of not misconceptions, but not a lot known about Fiji as a Pacific Island country. I remember freshman year introducing myself to people, and one of the first questions are, where are you from? And I'd say Fiji, and they'd be like, oh, like the water? And I'll say, yes, but also we're more than that. So Fiji is a country that we're known as an ocean state, like all the other Pacific countries. We are over 300 islands, so 330 islands, massive. Over half, or a little under half of them are inhabited. And that includes the two main islands where everybody lives, including some of the smaller islands that are, usually like whole island resorts where tourists come, or islands that are for day trips. So I grew up on Viti level, which translates to English, that means big island, and that's in Fijian. And so, and I grew up on a farm that my dad grew up on, and so we have ducks and chickens, and that's a house that I've lived in all my life.
So your parents, was their main income from the farm, or did they commute to a city to work?
Yeah, so my dad's main income was from the farm. He's a farmer. His parents were also farmers, so they all grew up on that farm. And then eventually when I was born back in 2004, my grandparents, my paternal grandparents, moved to a farm further outside, further away from Lautoka. And they mainly did vegetables, and they also had a few cows for dairy. My mom has had jobs. She works in HR, so she did also take a couple of years off to mostly help on the farm. But she's had jobs in town and in the city. Before we ended up moving to America, my mom actually worked for Fiji Airways in HR, so she would commute every day to Nandi, which was an hour away, just for work.
Okay. And did you have more than chickens and ducks on your farm?
No, primarily ducks.
Okay.
We were one of the few, if not one of the only farms on VT level that had ducks. And yeah, so those were the main two things. My dad had goats briefly. He had sheep, but mostly ducks and chickens.
Okay. Okay, great. And I know that you mentioned when we were in class last fall that at one point your family experienced a climate-related disaster.
Yeah.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it was, I say that, so this experience was one that stayed with me ever since, and it was definitely a formative experience for me as a young girl. So this happened back in 2016, which is now over a decade ago, February 20th. I'll never forget the day.
And you were how old again?
So I was 11 and my sister was 10, so we're very close in age. There was talks the week before that there was a cyclone that had started in the area, and it was interesting because it was not only gearing up in intensity but also speed, and usually cyclones are not that long-lived, so it was interesting that this one was like, we were still talking about it for a week, and then all of a sudden a few days before February 20th it like made a 180-degree turn. At this point it was a Category 5 tropical cyclone, and Cyclone Winston to date, 10 years later, even today, is still the strongest cyclone that's ever hit the southern hemisphere. So it was definitely a big storm. I remember it hit in the night. At that point, we had been through like a few cyclones as a kid, and then even after Winston, we did have a few cyclones that had come by, but nothing that really made landfall that close to home, as well as nothing that was that big or strong. And so I remember it hit at night, and the power went off, so the electricity went off a few hours before, and all night it was just, you could hear the wind beating on the roof, the tin rattling, and then at some point in the night, like half our roof flew off, and so our house started flooding, and it was in the middle of the night and you couldn't see anything, right? So there were only 2 dry rooms in our whole house, and so my parents put my sister and I to bed in one of them, and then they were moving all our furniture and stuff into the other room. And then I remember my sister had to go to the bathroom at 3 o'clock in the morning, and so my mom took her, and then it was just us wading through knee-deep water. And so we tried to sleep. I remember at one point, my sister was fast asleep, which I'm grateful for, but I remember at one point I could hear the ceiling lift up, and then it fell down again.
Oh my goodness.
And then we were just covered in dust because of that happening. And you could just hear the rain inside the house, outside the door. So it was it was a scary experience. The next morning we woke up, the sun was out. It had passed fully. But it was just the damage that was done to our farm and our house it took 8 months to rebuild. It was sad though, because for us it felt like our whole world was turned upside down, but for so many others in the country, you later find out that there's nothing that they can do but to pick up the broken pieces, and lives were lost. I think there were about 6 people who lost their lives during that cyclone. Because a lot of people evacuate to evacuation centers, so schools turn into evacuation centers. But then when you're talking about a Category 5 cyclone, you've never felt that intensity before, and you don't know what infrastructure would even be able to withstand something like that, because you've never had something like that. It definitely was a scary time, and as a country, we were rebuilding for, the years that came. I think they estimated in damages, it was over $1 billion what that did to our economy.
And in terms of your family, did you lose your farm? So what did you do while your house was being rebuilt, and how did it impact the farm animals and what you all were doing?
So we lost a lot of livestock. I was young, so I didn't really understand how a lot of that worked. I do know that our house, you couldn't live in our house. That wasn't an option just because of how bad it was. One of the things I remember too is when you have water damage in your house, the paint starts swelling because you have pockets of water bubbles. So that's one of the vivid memories I have. I remember our ceiling, it had been picked up, and that memory I had that night, but also you could see just the water accumulating and it getting heavier and heavier, and it just was seeping down. So we ended up moving to my grandparents' farm, who they live about a 15-minute drive from us in the opposite direction from Lautoka, so that our commute to school became a 45-minute drive instead of a 20-minute drive. So we were grateful enough to live with them for 8 months while my dad rebuilt our house. And my mom also commuted 1.5 hours to 2 hours every morning to work, while my dad, in addition to rebuilding our house, also, dealing with what we've lost on the farm and just bouncing back from that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, sorry your family went through that. So in terms of, you as a young person, as a student, did that change the way you thought, or any of your interests or professional goals having gone through that experience?
Yeah, for sure. And I think I said in the beginning that this experience was one that was very formative to me. I remember, so that was in 2016. In 2019, a year before COVID, there was a lot of talks about, climate change is a thing that people grew up already knowing in Fiji. I remember there were talks about, how much damage climate change is causing to Fiji, whereas people in countries like America were still questioning at that time whether it was even real, right?
What were some of the kinds of damages, like sea level rise or drought, or what were some of the...
So all of the above. So I think for me, Winston was Cyclone Winston was one of the moments in my head that was well, we had never seen cyclone that was that intense or that strong. But then after that, we were also seeing more cyclones come, right? And so to us, that was climate change. To us, the sea level rise, not only in Fiji, but in neighboring Pacific Island countries, you had people migrating from other countries like Kiribati and Tuvalu to Fiji because their homes were being lost to the ocean. And for communities that are so heavily dependent on the ocean for not only sustenance and livelihood, but also a lot of our cultural identity is tied to oceans, it's a hard thing to like lose everything you've ever known to that one like entity, right? And so for me with Winston, I think it was, or in the years preceding, Fiji also hosted or co-hosted, I think it was COP20, which was physically hosted in Bonn, Germany at the time. But Fiji was kind of like the spokesperson host because we don't have the infrastructure to host in Fiji.
Right.
So I remember there were all these talks about, you know, is this even a real thing? Whereas we're like dealing with the ramifications. So sea level rise, also droughts. Our monsoon seasons were also a lot longer. So that's our period from like November to April, which is also our cyclone season. And even today, there are talks of that season is now completely shifted, and the more accurate estimation is October through, you know, May, which is scary to think about. But I think for me personally, thinking about 3 years later, thinking about like what climate change is doing to us, it's not a question of, okay, quality of life. It's a question of survival at that point, right? And so thinking about, I don't think I could have seen myself like knowing that and just moving on with my life and not doing something about it. And the thought of, and I remember having this thought explicitly because it's something that I think about often. It's something I wrote about in my college admissions essays, something I wrote about when I was applying to graduate school in my personal statements, because it's something that really defines me, is the thought of another 11-year-old girl experiencing the fear I felt that night is something that I can't stand to bear, right? Because despite that being such like a crucial moment for me, or like a formative experience for me, there are people who don't necessarily have the privileges that I did, despite losing my whole house. Like we had like the ability to be able to repair and rebuild, right? And move on. But a lot of people don't have access to that. And when you're talking about, you know, Pacific Island people, it is a question of survival. And I think despite being, you know, 0.1% of the population, and despite being, I don't want to say, like, we are vulnerable, but I don't want to say, like, our voice is not being lost. And one of the grassroots campaigns I follow, their slogan I really like. So this is the Pacific Climate Warriors. Their campaign is, or their slogan is, "We are not drowning, we're fighting." And I think that is very powerful for our message as Pacific people. So that definitely has shaped, long-winded answer to your question, but that definitely has shaped where I see myself. And my goal is to eventually move back home and give back for the protection of our ocean spaces, because they are so meaningful to who we are and our identity.
Just sort of a little aside, but do you see a lot of adaptation as part of that future? Because obviously there's so many forces in terms of like forces that you have no control over. None of us do, but they're impacting you as a Pacific Islander more than the rest of us.
Yeah, for sure. I think that especially in the past few years, first looking globally, it's been encouraging to see kind of the mobilization of youth and like Indigenous voices and Pacific voices in spaces where changes can be made, to kind of represent our voices. So that's been encouraging to see. Internally, we've also seen, like within Fiji, we've seen a lot of emphasis being put on climate adaptation. So we have like a minister for climate change in our cabinet. And so not only making sure that we are prepared for future events, but also how can we provide kind of that safe haven for other Pacific Island residents who are seeking, that kind of space in Fiji because they can't live at home anymore. So I'll give you an example. So in Fiji, we have a tax that's called ECAL. So I think it stands for Environmental Climate Adaptation Levy. And so if you go and eat at a restaurant or if you're buying stuff, there's a tax that's taken out of that that is put towards climate adaptation infrastructure. And so in Fiji, it works different. So the price you see, like when you're either eating at a restaurant or you're buying, your groceries, like the VAT is already in it. So you're still essentially paying out the same price, but a portion of that is taken out for climate adaptation. And I think it's very important.
The value-added tax. So part of the value add goes to climate adaptation.
A portion of it, yes.
It makes me think, it's probably a sort of distant connection, but how much the world is learning from Ukraine, another smallish, not so small, but smallish country, about drone warfare, and like all of a sudden, instead of the United States being the provider and the country on top, like we need to turn to them, and Europe is turning to them to learn. And I feel like it could be the same looking at Fiji and maybe other island nations in terms of, what would be some, climate adaptation policies, or what are some things after we get through this period of climate denial, which I think we will, I feel like we'll have a lot to learn from you.
Yeah, for sure. I agree. And I think we have a lot to say, but the things we have to say, like, are important and they mean something. And I think it's just frustrating as Pacific people that we contribute like relatively like a drop in the bucket of global greenhouse gas emissions, but we've been at the forefront of the climate crisis for decades now. It was declared a climate crisis, globally not that long ago, but for us, it's always been a crisis for decades. Like there's never been a time, I don't think there's a single child in Fiji who grows up who doesn't know what climate change is, because it's so embedded into the way we live our lives. And so I think it's definitely climate awareness, climate education, but also climate adaptation, and how can you ensure that we are surviving not only like as a nation but as global people. Because if you look at Tuvalu, for example, they're projected to be underwater by I think it's 2050, and that's sad. And now they're talking about digitizing their culture, but how do you do that,
That's the country where the prime minister or the president was filmed, like
standing in the water. And that place wasn't underwater so many years prior, right? And that was a powerful message too. I think it was a few COPs after COP20, or it might have been COP20. But yeah, I think it's something that's so real for us that it's frustrating that we're still in this predicament, and why we aren't working towards tangible solutions. We're more so fighting and getting caught up in the politics of it all, especially globally.
On this end. Well, thank you. This was like super interesting, and I really appreciate what you're sharing and what you're doing. Do you have anything else you sort of want to share with our audience? Because I feel like you've been very articulate in some words that, really are going to make us think.
Yeah.
Is there any other lessons or?
Yeah. I think that the one thing I'll say is, as an individual, it can be, and I've faced this myself personally, it can be hard to feel like, oh, I'm just one person. What difference will I make in the world? I think if we all started thinking or kept thinking like this, nothing would happen. So my advice, or my, I guess, food for thought would be, like, your change does matter, and think about how you, as an individual, even if the small steps, they all do add up. If everybody did one small thing, that can equate to one big thing globally. And those are so important, especially today when we're thinking about, what is climate change? What are the main drivers of it? When we think about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, that are, they were these goals that were established to be achieved by 2030. We're way past that, Now they're thinking about, okay, what's the next set of goals for the next decade? And, would we even be able to achieve these goals in the next decade, right? So I think be a good global citizen, and your change really does make a difference. And if me personally, if I was, a teenager and I thought, well, there's nothing we can do, we're all doomed anyways or something, you can't just give up, because oftentimes that that's a matter of survival for a lot of people. And so your choices do matter.
Well, thank you, Janet. Really appreciate you sharing your words. And I just wanted to let our listeners, our watchers, know that Janet is off to Duke University to pursue a PhD in marine ecology, marine biology,
Marine conservation.
marine conservation this fall after spending the summer at home in Fiji.
Yep.
So I wish you the best of luck and
Thank you.
really, really appreciate you sharing your experiences plus your words of wisdom. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.